lost his father and had to learn to be more responsible for himself. After his father's death, he was mentored by his half-brother, Lawrence. From Lawrence and his wife, Anne Fairfax, George learned about literature, culture, and advanced math. These math skills came in handy in 1748 when 16-year-old George set out on his first grand adventure, a surveying mission in the thick woods of the Shenandoah Valley. During the trip, he discovered his interest in exploring and plotting land and was soon hired as the surveyor for his county. Shortly after, in 1752, George's brother died, but his influence on George would last for years to come. George greatly admired his older brother, a militia veteran, and was inspired to follow in his footsteps. George Washington's early years shaped the values and character that he later became known for. Let's review what we've learned about them. Question 1. When was George Washington born? A. 1750. B. 1776. C. 1702. D. 1732. The correct answer is D. George Washington was born in the year 1732. Question 2. What skills did George Washington learn as a child? A. Planting and surveying. B. Tailoring and cooking. C. Fencing and shooting. D. Blacksmithing and shoemaking. If you said A, George Washington learned planting and surveying as a child, you are correct. Question 3. Where did George Washington conduct his first surveying mission? A. Upstate New York. B. Rocky Mountains. C. Shenandoah Valley. D. Kanawha River. The correct answer is C. George Washington conducted his first surveying mission in the Shenandoah Valley. George Washington's military career. In 1753, George took over his brother's position in the militia, and just in time for the conflict between Britain and France to heat up. French troops had begun to occupy American land claimed by Britain, and 21-year-old Washington was sent to firmly request the French troops to leave and retreat north. He trekked through miles upon miles of snow-covered forests and across treacherously icy rivers to deliver his message. And although France denied his request, he returned home a hero. The Journal of Major George Washington was published to document his travels, and word of his bravery quickly spread throughout the colonies and all the way across the Atlantic to Europe.
I was grateful for my experience trekking through excessive rains and vast quantities of snow. Even though it was difficult, it prepared me for the even more challenging winters of wars to come.
After his first assignment, Washington quickly became involved in actual combat, which also prepared him for his future military career. His first skirmishes against the French were also the first battles of what would become the 7 Years' War. Although Washington was forced to surrender after these first few battles, he developed leadership skills that would eventually make him a great general. In 1755, Washington redeemed himself by serving as an aide to General Edward Braddock, fighting valiantly and skillfully against French troops. It is rumored that he emerged from battle with 4 bullet holes in his coat, but not a single scratch on his body. He was granted the title of colonel for his achievements. In 1758, he took a brief break from his military career to work on his plantation on Mount Vernon, which he had inherited after his brother's death.
During my break from war, I also met a lovely woman named Martha. She was kind and intelligent, and we were soon happily married and ready to begin our lives together at Mount Vernon.
While living there, he was deeply devoted to his estate and took great pride in his tobacco and wheat crops.
I was always a simple Virginian farmer at heart. Throughout my life, I longed to return to Mount Vernon, but found myself torn away time and time again by my duty to my country.
He actually first began to realize this duty during his years at Mount Vernon. Like many other colonial farmers, he quickly grew tired of British taxes and regulations. Because of this, he began to disapprove of British governance of the colonies and became more interested in politics. Let's review what we just learned about the beginning of Washington's military and political career. Question 1. During which war did George Washington first gain military experience? A. Revolutionary War. B. Civil War. C. War of 1812. D. 7 Years' War. If you said D, George Washington first gained military experience during the 7 Years' War, you are correct. Question 2. What title was he granted for his service to General Edward Braddock during the 7 Years' War? A. Commander. B. Colonel. C. Major. D. Soldier. The correct answer is B. He was granted the title of Colonel for his service to General Edward Braddock during the 7 Years' War. Question 3. What was the name of George Washington's estate? A. Mount Vernon. B. Mount Rushmore. C. Mount Virginia. D. Mount Washington. If you said A, the name of George Washington's estate was Mount Vernon, you are correct. George Washington and the Revolution. After his military service in the 7 Years' War, Washington became increasingly politically involved. In 1758, he won the election to the House of Burgesses, Virginia's legislature, and in 1760, he became his county's Justice of the Peace. During his service, he became more frustrated with Britain's control over the colonies and decided it was time to take action against their oppressive ruler. He attended both the First and Second Continental Congresses, during which he and representatives from the colonies met to discuss the possibility of rebellion. In 1775, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress finally decided to declare war on Britain and named none other than the highly acclaimed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the American Army.
I was proud to accept the position, as I believe that every post is honorable in which a man can serve his country. But I knew how difficult it would be to defeat the British Army.
In fact, it seemed nearly impossible. While Washington's army was a ragtag group of amateur soldiers with few resources, Britain's was massive and expertly trained. Washington faced his first major defeat when he lost the city of New York to the Redcoats in 1776. This was followed by many similar losses, but General Washington believed too strongly in the American cause to give up. In December of 1776, Washington used an ingenious strategy to help turn the tide of the war: a sneak attack. On Christmas night, Washington rallied his men and led them across the Delaware River to fight and ultimately defeat British troops. This is an example of one of Washington's greatest leadership qualities: his ability to inspire. The soldiers were freezing, exhausted, ill, and starving, but were motivated by Washington's passion and determination.
Perseverance and spirit have done wonders in all ages, and I knew they would do the same for our revolution, but I can't take all the credit for our victory. It was also the power of my soldiers' belief in their rights and in their country.
This perseverance, and of course Washington's leadership, granted the ragged American army much-needed victories. But the war dragged on into 1781, and many feared defeat.
This is true. In January of 1781, I wrote to my comrade John Laurens that our time was now or never.
And Washington clearly decided that their time had indeed arrived. He led American troops to a decisive victory at the Battle of Yorktown, and on October 19, 1781, after years of fighting, Britain surrendered, and America had officially won the Revolutionary War. Although George Washington is most famous for his impact as our nation's first president, he also accomplished many things as a soldier and contributor to the Revolution. Let's review what we've learned. Question 1. What position was Washington granted at the Second Continental Congress? A. Lieutenant. B. Surgeon General. C. Commander-in-Chief. D. Vice President. The correct answer is C. Washington was granted the position of Commander-in-Chief. Question 2. Which river did Washington famously cross in 1776? A. Delaware. B. Hudson. C. Mississippi. D. American. The correct answer is A. Washington famously crossed the Delaware River in 1776. Question 3. What was the final battle of the Revolutionary War? A. Battle of Yorktown. B. Battle of Bunker Hill. C. Battle of Monmouth. D. Battle of Saratoga. The correct answer is A. The Battle of Yorktown was the final battle of the Revolutionary War. George Washington's presidency. Now that the war had finally come to a close and the nation had won its independence, America had to figure out how it would function on its own. In 1785, Washington proposed to his friend James Madison the idea of a United States Constitution. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention began, and it lasted for 4 long months.
It was a difficult process, but to form a new government requires infinite care and unbounded attention.
Washington gladly provided this attention and took a leading role in devising the document that would define our government for centuries to come.
Indeed, that was our intention. In fact, I once said that the Constitution is the guide which I will never abandon.
Naturally, Washington was overjoyed when a majority of the colonies ratified or approved the Constitution. And when the new nation held its first ever presidential election, Washington won unanimously by getting all 69 electoral votes in 1789.
Truly, I wanted nothing more than to return to my humble Virginia farm life. But I knew that the young United States needed me. So I accepted the position and was indeed inaugurated in 1789.
Washington knew that he would set an example for future presidents to follow, so he dedicated himself to being an honest, fair, and strong leader. He established a precedent, or a model, for how the executive department would function and signed many laws, including one that created a national bank. Washington also started traditions such as interacting with citizens and creating the cabinet, a group of presidential advisors such as the Secretary of the Treasury, originally Washington's colleague, Alexander Hamilton.
I always said, be courteous to all, but intimate with a few, and let those few be tried before you give them your confidence. I try to be kind to all, and I love to meet with the public, but I especially value the opinions of my trusted cabinet advisors, whom I worked with for many years.
Washington also successfully kept the nation stable and peaceful. For example, he quelled the Whiskey Rebellion in 1791 when he led the military to a group of rioters in Pennsylvania. Not only did Washington keep the peace within the United States, but he also prevented the nation from becoming involved in foreign wars as tensions grew between Britain and France. He continued to warn against the entangling of the nation in foreign affairs throughout his 8-year presidency.
I advise that we observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. I wanted America to be at peace with other countries, but to be able to stand on its own.
This was one of the key points of Washington's famed farewell address, which he gave shortly before he left office in 1796. In the address, he also expressed his fears of political parties and their ability to divide the nation, urging the importance of unity, which he had worked hard to preserve during his two-term presidency. At the time, many did not understand Washington's choice not to run for office for a third term, but doing so affirmed America's model of democracy.
I didn't want the American people to be ruled by a king as they had before, not by me or any future president. I hoped that I would set an example by giving up my power after I'd done everything I could for my country.
Washington truly did set a remarkable example with his presidency. Let's review all the important facts we just learned about Washington's time in office. Question 1. What presidential tradition did Washington start? A. Living in the White House. B. Having a cabinet of advisors. C. Going to war. D. Building a statue in his honor. The correct answer is B. Washington started the presidential tradition of having a cabinet of advisors. Question 2. How many years was Washington in office? A. 8. B. 4. C. 10. D. 20. If you said A, Washington was in office for 8 years, you are correct. Let's do one more. Question 3. What was one of the ideas Washington stressed in his farewell address? A. The importance of having a powerful president. B. The importance of unity. C. The importance of exploration. D. The importance of making foreign alliances. The correct answer is B. In his farewell address, Washington stressed the importance of unity. George Washington's later years and legacy. After his presidency, Washington returned to his beloved Mount Vernon home with his wife, Martha. He had always dreamed of a simple life on his farm, and he spent his last years achieving this dream, confident that he had done everything he could to serve his nation. He died on December 14, 1799, with his wife at his side. But Washington's memory and impacts continue to live on. He is fondly referred to as the father of his country, and reminders of his important role can be seen everywhere. Most famously, Washington's portrait is featured on the $1 bill and carved into the side of Mount Rushmore. The National Washington Monument, a tall stone structure in Washington, D.C., was also built in his honor in 1884. In addition to these notable monuments, Washington has been recognized in novels, films, the names of universities, museums, bridges, statues, and in many other forms. Not only does Washington live on in monuments and memorials, but also in the American political system, even today. Washington's values and beliefs remain a part of our nation's government. He believed in a nation of liberty and unity, which we continue to strive for.
Liberty, when it takes root, is a plant of rapid growth. I hope that by laying a strong foundation for our country, it would continue to grow in the right direction.
Washington's life of service sets an inspiring example for all. He remains a model of what a president should be. Not a king or a ruler, but a servant and a leader. And he also reminds us of how to be a good citizen, with honesty, fairness, and dedication. Washington, once described as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, will go down in our nation's history not only as a president, but as a general, a commander, a scholar, and a true leader. Let's review what we've learned about the extraordinary legacy of George Washington. Question 1. Which U.S. bill is Washington featured on? A. $10. B. $5. C. $1, D, $100. The correct answer is C. Washington is featured on the U.S. $1 bill. Question 2. Which of these is a monument that commemorates George Washington? A. Statue of Liberty. B. Mount Rushmore. C. White House. D. National Archives. The correct answer is B. Mount Rushmore is a monument that commemorates George Washington. Last one. Question 3. What nickname is George Washington known by? A. Old Hickory. B. Fighting George. C. America's Captain. D. Father of his country. If you said D, George Washington is known by the nickname Father of his country, then you are correct. Thinking question. Why are values such as liberty and unity important to our government? And how can we contribute to them today?